that. If you're new to stamping or you're intimidated by stamping, maybe I'll give you a few ideas as well. So the first tip that I tell anybody, because I love to stamp, stamping is super fun. Hi, Karen. So the very first thing that I would do is make sure that you have a good, nice, hard surface. So I do have a wood desk, and that's really probably the best surface is something hard. A lot of us though, hi Iris, a lot of us craft on those, plastic tables, and they have a little give in them, or sometimes you go to a crop and they're those plastic setup tables. You're really not going to get a good impression. So you need to make sure that you have a good foundation. So I use a tile or my desk, but if you don't have that, you can get a tile. So I'm a DIY person. This is leftover. You can do a tile or a piece of wood, whatever you have. This is a good option because it's small. So the first tip is making sure that you have a good foundation, making sure that you have a hard surface. And then the next thing that I would say for you to do is to also have some type of foam. So I stamped 3 images. So I stamped this on a plastic table. I stamped this one just on the tile here. And that was a pretty good image, but you can still see where it didn't fill in all the way. And sometimes that's good. Like, this is kind of cute. I mean, that's not bad. But if you want a really super solid image, you're going to want a hard surface and a foam pad. Look how nice that is. That's a nice solid surface. So that takes you through 3 different things. All right, so hard surface, piece of foam. That's your best bet. The other thing I like to use is a stamp platform, and a lot of people are familiar with that. Hi, Barbara. Hi, Stacy. And you can use a stamp platform. I use this a lot. Hi, Becky. And so this is if I want to get a lot of cards or a lot of replicate my stamping over and over, I'll use a stamp platform, and it has a foam thing in there. So tip number 1, make sure that you have the right foundation. That's probably the number 1 thing that people forget about, and they'll get very frustrated getting a spotty stamp. Hello, Kathy. All right, so that's tip number 1. Tip number 2, and this is really important as well. So you want to make sure that you prepare your stamps. So I've worked in manufacturing a long time, and I've worked in molding, and I've worked with monomers and photopolymers, and I could probably talk way nerdy than anybody ever really would want to listen to that. But when you get stamps from the manufacturer, a lot of times they have what's called a surfactant on it. And so sometimes the photopolymer does, depending on how the process of stamps, if it's through a negative, and there are just different ways to make stamps, but there generally is a residue on there. And so if you take a stamp like this one and want to just stamp it straight up out the packaging, you're probably going to get something spotty. And a lot of people do that. They're so excited. They have a brand new stamp set. They bring that thing home and then they stamp it and they're really disappointed. So my first tip of the second first tip is you want to make sure that you can do 2 or 3 things to get that surfactant off. I'm lazy, so I don't go wash the stamp. You can wash it, so go and just wash it. You can wash it off, and that's nice and clean. A baby wipe doesn't always really get the residue, so you can wash it or wipe it, but I'm going to show you the lazy crafter way to do it, okay? So let me grab my surface here. So if you want to get a nice clear image right off the bat, I do 2 things that without having to wash it. I will either get an alcohol ink and stamp it with that ink 2 or 3 or 4 times and make sure that alcohol ink will kind of soak into the stamp and cleans it off. Or if some people are very concerned about staining their stamps, I'm not, and let me show you. I mean, they stamp whether they get stained or not, and that color doesn't transfer to other projects. They still stamp clean, but some people are very concerned about that. So if you're concerned about it, then instead of using an archival ink, you can use a watermark ink the first time. This is very sticky, and this is a way to prepare your stamp. So that's like the lazy stamper's way to do it instead of washing it. And some people take an eraser or sand it because they feel like the ink is not soaking into the stamp, and that's because of that surfactant from the manufacturer. It's really not because of the material, it's really because of what's on top. You need to make sure you clean off what's on top. So here's my favorite way to clean off what's on top. I'm going to use this leaf in the third tip. So let me grab a stamp here. We're going to stamp this lady. So what I do is I just put it in the alcohol ink and I stamp it 2 or 3 times until I get a nice clear image. And that looks pretty good. Yeah. So now my stamp is prepared and I can stamp it with color. So I'm just going to kind of wipe it off. And I'm going to just dry it off. And then I'm going to pick a color. So let's pick what color do we want? How about maybe Daydream by Catherine Pooler. Okay. And see how pretty that is? And, you know, that black didn't carry over. That's one way to prepare your stamp to get a really good solid image. And then also the watermark pad. So I just use this one for prep because it's old, and that's why it's got, you know, the black in here. I've gotten to where I don't use it anymore for embossing. So let's do that. So we're going to prepare the stamp using that method. So I just tap it in and I stamp it 2 or 3 times. You're really not going to be able to see it because it's a clear stamp, and that kind of prepares it and gets it ready. And then I'm going to wipe off the excess, dry it a tiny bit, and then it's ready to stamp a nice crisp image. Yep. I'm going to stamp that a couple times here. And it stamps pretty consistent. All right, so prepare your stamps. That was tip number 2. Make sure that you clean that surfactant off the top. Wash it, use an alcohol ink, or use a Versamark ink, and then you should be good to go with the stamp. All right, so the very third and last tip, and after I do this last tip, I'm going to stamp a couple backgrounds with these stamps. So the third tip that I would say is ink makes a really big difference. So a lot of people go, I'm not picking on this brand, it's the only pigment ink that I own. I don't really own any other pigment inks. This poor little stamp pad who's been through it is the only one I own. So I'm going to demo using it. Pigment inks are good. They're good for a lot of different things. They don't soak through your paper. If you don't care, like if the image is modeled, I mean, this is great for a lot of distressed looks. So it's a good ink, but not if you want a super clear, crisp image. If you're going for this, that's not going to give it to you. And this is the most common ink that's sold that you see in stores or craft stores. You'll see this one, and a lot of people go and pick that up, then they stamp right out the package, and then that gives them this, and then they're not happy with it. So just understanding the different inks kind of helps out too. So you have pigment ink, then you have premium dye ink, and this is my favorite. Then you have alcohol ink. And I'm only going to talk about these 3 because there are so many different kinds. But I'm going to demo these 3. So with pigment ink, so let's go get our leaf back. Pigment ink, where did my paper go? There's my paper. It's going to look like this. So this is straight out the package from the manufacturer. I didn't even prepare it or clean it. So this is very common, a very common experience. Just peeling it off. I'm excited about my new stamp. I want to use it on my project. And then, what happened? Right? So then I'm really disappointed, and then I feel like I'm a terrible stamper, and then I might not do it again. So let's take it from that to good, okay? So your pigment inks are not going to give you that clear, crisp image. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to follow my own advice, and I'm going to prepare the stamp. So this is just what I do every time. I just stamp it with archival ink a few times until oops, I didn't clean it all. Didn't clean all the orange off. Get that orange off. Okay. All right, so this is Lazy Stampers Unite. I stamp with my archival ink pad a few times until I feel like I'm getting a clear image. And it might take 3 or 4 times for it to soak in all the places. So I just keep doing it until I get a solid image. Hope we're getting close. Looks like I got like a little hole in my stamp there. All right, stamp. This is another manufacturer stamp. Let me grab another one. Let's grab this one. So this is from the Unity collection, and it's got a nice solid surface. Yeah, there we go. I don't have any dips in the photopolymer. All right. So I'm going to stamp that until I get a clear image. Okay, so you can see like the first time I stamped it, it was kind of mottled, and then I stamped it, and then we're getting darker here. So you want to stamp it several times to get that ink in, that archival ink, and then that'll help in the future stamping other inks. So now we're going to grab a premium dye ink, and so if you're going to stamp on your project, I would tell you to stamp 2 or 3 times on test papers, and you see how I just did that before you commit. You want to make sure that you're getting the right combination of surface, foundation, and the right kind of ink before you put that straight on your project, because you don't want to be disappointed and you don't want to mess it up. And look how nice and dark that looks. I'm going to stamp it again. And so then you have a nice, really solid image. And that's from a premium dye ink. That's a Catherine Pooler ink. I do carry Catherine Pooler inks in my store. So if you want some, they're the best. I thought about doing my own, but you know what? How can you improve on something that's super fantastic? And I think Catherine Pooler inks are super fantastic. She's another woman-owned business. And so I support her. I cannot reinvent amazing. And I feel like these premium dye inks are amazing. All right, so now that we've gone through those 3 tips, so it was having the right foundation, making sure you prepare your stamps, and then knowing what kind of inks you want to use on your project.